When we talk about fat, it seems like there's only one type of fat, but the reality is that not all fat is the same. But what's more, abdominal subcutaneous fat behaves differently than subcutaneous fat in other parts of the body. We usually call this fat stubborn fat, referring to the fact that it's very hard to get rid of. It doesn't obey. Even when with an adequate caloric deficit, we manage to lose fat in other parts of the body. But what are the weak points of this stubborn fat and how can we speed up its elimination? That's exactly what we're going to see in today's video. But before that, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel. It's a very simple gesture that will ensure you get better videos each time. Stubborn fat in men usually accumulates in the lower part of the abdomen, both in the front region and on the sides of the abdomen. Women, however, have a different fat distribution, making it typically harder to lose fat from the legs, buttocks, and hips. As previously mentioned, you have likely lost fat in other body parts and your weight has decreased. Even the anthropometric study may tell you that you have more muscle and less fat. But still, you have that stubborn fat remains there, unmoved. Despite all your effort and sacrifices, this usually generates much frustration. Have you experienced this before? Share your story in the comments, and what causes this, you may be curious to know. Well, fundamentally for two reasons. The first reason is low blood flow to that fat, to those adipocytes. The less vascularized areas release fewer fatty acids into the blood precisely because they have less access to the blood. Remember that to lose fat, we need two fundamental steps. The release of fat from the deposits, usually the adipocytes, into the blood. This process was called lipolysis, and the oxidation of that fat in the mitochondria of different cells, for example muscle cells. And this process was called beta oxidation of fatty acids. But there is a second reason, and that second reason are the different adrenergic receptors. They are receptors that are stimulated by different environmental stimuli, hormones, and other aspects. Well, these stubborn fat regions have a higher proportion of alpha adrenergic receptors than beta adrenergic receptors. As the caloric deficit and the hormones released during this deficit and during exercise act especially on the beta receptors. Because fatty acids will be released into the blood more slowly from these fat regions. That is, lipolysis is slower and more tortuous in stubborn fat. In fact, the activation of alpha receptors sometimes has an anti-lipolytic effect as it causes vasoconstriction, worsening the problem we mentioned in the previous section. And what can we do? We can do quite a few things, none miraculous, none simple, but there are things to implement. A caloric deficit is necessary to lose this fat, as is obvious, but sometimes we have to have a little more patience. That is, stay longer in a caloric deficit, even when we have already achieved reasonable and expected total fat losses. Other times, we have to intensify that caloric deficit if we want to lose that stubborn fat. I know these are not good news. Let's see what else we can do to activate lipolysis in those areas, other than starving or starving for longer. First, the calorie log. Look, I'll be very honest with you. I don't like counting calories at all, and I generally don't like it when my patients have to count them either. Can you lose fat and have an attractive and healthy physique without counting a single calorie? You can, but I also tell you that if what you want is to lose that last stubborn belly fat you have left, or drop from an 8% to a 7% body fat percentage, you have to count calories, at least for a while. This is because we have to make sure we continue in a caloric deficit, and this is not as simple as it seems. You will have to take into account the calories from condiments, sauces, dressings, oils, and other details that we would normally overlook. I will provide an alternative later which works well for some people. However, you'll say, okay, but I can't keep indefinitely cutting calories or counting them, or else I'm going to end up eating practically nothing. You're absolutely right. It's not psychologically healthy. Do we have any solution to this? Well, at least a partial solution or an alternative. These are called refits. Watch out, because it's easy to turn these refits into binges, so be very careful with this. What does a refit consist of? Well, a refit consists of during a period of caloric deficit. Return for 24, 48, or at most 72 hours. To eat your maintenance calories, or maybe a little more. If you're consuming around 2,200 calories and maintaining a calorie deficit at that intake level, and you have a maintenance of about 2,800 calories. So from Monday to Friday, you stay at those 2,200 calories, and every 4 weeks, approximately, on Saturday and Sunday, you increase the calories to 2,800, 3,000 calories. Note, every 4 to 6 weeks, but not every weekend. In fact, this is the fundamental mistake of most people who are losing fat. They do a refill every weekend and cancel out the progress they've made during that week. Has this happened to you while trying to lose fat? Comment below. A good way to do this, almost without realizing it, and it works very well in some people, no, also in others. It's to implement intermittent fasting from Monday to Friday and then return to a regular meal pattern on the weekend. We have been able to verify how, spontaneously, during intermittent fasting, we ingest 10 to 20% less calories without counting calories, and this is important. However, this depends on your fasting window duration and the specific intermittent fasting protocol you follow. Obviously, there are people who prefer intermittent fasting over counting calories. Me, for example, why? Well, because I find it really tedious to count calories. I can't stand it, although I understand that in certain contexts it's necessary. Does it happen to you too? Let me know in the comments below. Getting back to the refits. They're also interesting because when we've been dieting for a while, significant metabolic adaptations occur in your body. Your appetite increases due to the modulation of orexigenic and anorexigenic hormones, that is, hormones that regulate hunger and satiety. This makes it increasingly difficult to maintain this situation with the psychological toll it also entails. Your total daily energy expenditure will decrease over time, also due to something I'll mention next. You're going to lose lean mass, which is difficult to regain later, and even in a very aggressive deficit, you can have a decrease in important hormones like thyroid hormones. What Refit aims to do is, once these adaptations are emerging or starting to emerge, cut them off and start over. It's a way to trick your body into thinking that the caloric deficit has ended, when all you're doing is taking a break of 1, 2, or 3 days from that deficit. Another related concept is dietary cycling. In fact, we can use this dietary cycling to design even more reasonable and easier to carry out fat loss programs. I would also say healthier. For example, we can design 2 weeks of caloric deficit and 2 weeks of maintenance and carry out this process successively. Fat loss will take a bit longer than if we go full throttle than if we keep a caloric deficit until we reach our goal. But that intermittence between a period of deficit and a period of maintenance is going to increase the adherence of the one who's doing it. The weight loss, which will make the whole process much more bearable. How would you prefer to lose fat? Would you prefer doing a single period of maximum deficit or alternating between deficit and maintenance until you achieve your goal? Even if it takes longer, I'll read it below. Another key benefit of refit strategies is that they help maintain the weight lost for longer. Time, always. I always say that losing fat is not the most complex thing. It's not easy, but it's not the most complex. The hardest thing is not to gain it back. In the 12 months following the end of the diet, that's the hardest part. Let's now talk about the NID, another problem that needs to be overcome when you want to lose stubborn fat. The NID decreases, and it can decrease a lot. The non-exercise activity thermogenesis is the energy expended on daily non-sporting activities like shopping and picking up kids. Mowing the lawn. This non-exercise activity thermogenesis, even though you may think it's something that totally depends on your will, depends on much more than that. For example, on days when you've trained very hard, perhaps for several hours, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis is going to reduce a lot spontaneously. It's your body's way of telling you, hey, that's enough, calm down, you've already spent a lot of energy today, relax. But does the same thing happen exactly when you diet for a sufficient amount of time? Your body tells you, hey, you're not eating enough, take it easy, no need for a 3-hour walk right now. What are you telling me? Therefore, being aware that your body will reduce the NIT, which is a huge contributor to your total daily energy expenditure, you should establish strategies to increase it. And conscious strategies like setting a daily step goal, or setting alarms to go for a walk or get up from your chair when you've been sitting for several hours. But without reaching the point of neurosis that I'm already seeing some of you checking your watch every hour and a half to go for a walk. Supplements. You're probably wondering about supplements that work for fat loss. Any of the supplements I'll mention. They will only work if, through diet and your energy expenditure, you stay in the caloric deficit we've talked about. Otherwise, it doesn't work. You can use all the caffeine you want. Being in a super caloric habit, it won't do you any good. To lose fat, caffeine, green tea, fish and ephedrine, whey protein all can help you in one way or another to lose fat and stubborn fat. And finally, it's impossible not to mention strength training. It should always be present. And if your goal is to have a good abdomen, don't forget the training of the abdomen. If you don't train the abdomen, that muscle group won't reach a size large enough to be visible when the body fat percentage decreases, right? Reducing the percentage of subcutaneous fat is necessary, but you have to increase muscle size, and that can only be achieved through training. So guys, we've looked at several strategies to decrease that annoying stubborn fat. Tell me in the comments if you liked the video, and if it was useful, I encourage you to subscribe so we can have better videos. See you tomorrow. A big hug and keep empowering.